Welcome to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm Tatiana Serafin, Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. My co-host Nick Vosdev is in the air at the moment doing great things. So it'll be me today talking to Nahal Toosi, Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent for Politico. Nahal joins us for the fourth time here at the Doorstep to share her insights into U.S. foreign policy in a moment. I do want to mention we have the second anniversary of the Ukraine war coming up, and we will be discussing next week what that means. So please join us next week. And join us March 19th for our next book talk with Elliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis for their new book, 2054. They also come back to join us as a follow-up to their book, 2034. It should be a good one. Welcome back to the Doorstep, Nahal. We are so excited to have you for your fourth time speaking with us. I cannot believe it. It's our fourth season. It's your fourth time here. Thank you for taking the time to join us again. We so appreciate your inside look at U.S. foreign policy, how it relates to what's going on domestically, how the U.S. looks in the world. You started out with us on October 9th, 2020. I can't believe it. That's your first appearance on our second ever Doorstep. We were in the middle of a pandemic, so we spent so much time talking about Blinken's virtual diplomacy. And it is so different now because you recently wrote a new piece about Blinken, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And we've come so far, or have we? What is your sense, from October 9th, 2020 to today? The world has changed, but how much has the U.S. changed in the world? Are we better off? We had so many questions that first episode because we were in the middle of an election. We didn't know where we were going. It was Trump v. Biden. And guess what? We're 2024 and it's like Groundhog Day. So has anything changed?
I love how the definition of Groundhog Day, now really the movie, as opposed to the actual definition of Groundhog Day, which is about the winter. In some ways, yes, many things have changed. I mean, the pandemic has certainly receded. In many ways, the Biden administration has rebuilt U.S. alliances and friendships around the world. There is a bit more confidence in the U.S., but there is this constant uncertainty around the world as to how long the U.S. is going to be reliable. And it is because of the potential return of Trump. And so you have a lot of world leaders who are very concerned about another kind of 180-degree, pendulum swing in U.S. policy, foreign policy in particular, if Trump takes power once more in the White House, or I should add, if any Republican takes power. I mean, it might not be a 180, but it might be like a 150, because there is definitely a sense among world leaders and that there's just something fundamentally different in the Republican Party now. That so many Americans just don't see the world in the same way that the Ronald Reagan Republicans once did. So things have really changed.
Yeah, and I think that goes to our podcast. I'm going to refer back to them because they were good, and I encourage our audience to go back and listen to them because I do think they tell a story of the U.S. if you're looking at history and where we've gone. But in March of 2022, we spent a lot of time talking about the consensus with the Republicans on the Ukraine war and how we were proceeding with a solid face against Russia. And there was more of an optimism about this, negotiation and cooperation between Democrats and Republicans on the foreign policy front. And that has eroded, which I think you're alluding to. What are you seeing, externally about why this erosion happened? Is it being blamed solely on the Republicans or on the Democrats? What are people saying? You were at Davos. And so I know you heard many things from world leaders, from CEOs about the US positioning and what's going on. I mean, a lot of people are looking at us. What are they saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting, that every year of the Biden presidency so far, there's been one major international crisis, right? Afghanistan was in the first year. It was a total debacle for the administration. And then they kind of got their act together, and then Ukraine came along. And then this year there's been well, actually no, I guess last year now, um, there was the Middle East crisis. So I'm one of those people who's also kind of wondering, well, what is going to be the big foreign policy crisis in 2024? But no, I mean, to your question as to um, what is the situation and kind of like in terms of the erosion of support for Ukraine in particular. Yeah, look, it was really striking early on to see this incredible bipartisan support for Ukraine. Lawmakers, pretty much across the board, Republican, Democrat, solidly behind President Biden's efforts to support the Ukrainians. But look, these stories always have a particular type of arc. And the reality is, I think a lot of people thought this was going to be a short war. I don't personally understand that. Like, I don't know why anybody thinks any war is ever going to be short. I feel like wars are always ongoing and they never really quite end. But, I think and so it was kind of inevitable that you were gonna get over time a certain growing impatience with the length of the war and what can be done to bring it to an end and how many US resources are going to go to it. But that's kind of the normal side of it. What's unusual is a small group of Republicans who are very much what we call now the far right, which when I first started at Politico like 10 years ago, we didn't use that term. And now it's pretty common to refer to far right Republicans. And they have from the beginning questioned the support for Ukraine. And early on, we were told by more mainstream Republicans, oh, just ignore them. They're just a small group. They're nothing. And now their views have very much affected much of the party. They've put a lot of the mainstream folks on notice on this Ukraine issue and said, you can't just pass this aid. There have to be more restrictions, or they really just don't necessarily want to support the aid at all. And so what's happened is you have all this domestic politics playing in, and that's kind of what's driving a lot of foreign officials crazy. Is what's going on is they're seeing the United States, especially among Republicans, connect domestic issues, kind of unsolvable domestic issues or intractable ones like immigration, not unsolvable, but intractable, to a major international security issue like Ukraine. And that is kind of a recipe to get nothing done. So you have a situation where there are people in the House of Representatives who are saying we're not going to pass a Ukraine aid bill unless we can get a border security bill. And the problem with that is the domestic politics playing once again with President Trump saying, no, you cannot pass a border bill because I don't want the immigration problem to be solved this year. I need that to run on as a campaign issue. And foreign diplomats and others that I talk to, they know this. They know, they're like, oh my gosh, the Republicans are connecting Ukraine, which needs to be taken care of, to this border crisis, which many of them have no actual incentive to solve. Because if they were to solve the border crisis through legislation or whatever, they don't have anything to yell about on the campaign trail. It robs them of an issue that rallies voters and gets people to their side. So this has become a real problem. So you see this combination of the domestic problems that rally campaigns to this foreign crisis, and foreign leaders look at this and they think this is a really, really dangerous move. They really wish that the United States, when it comes to its foreign policy, its international security, that it would speak with one voice. And instead, you have a small group of people who have managed to kind of really throw a wrench in things. And mainstream Republicans are increasingly scared of them because they think that if they go against this group, the base will turn out against them and they will be face primary challenges from the right and they will lose their seats. It's toxic in the words of many of the foreign diplomats that I've spoken to.
So what's interesting in this discussion is that, once we talked about the great opportunity to tie domestic and foreign policy, and you referred to it, as omnipolicy. We talked a great deal about it in our May 2021 episode. What does Biden's omnipolicy mean for the U.S.? And his idea to make sure that we had a foreign policy for the middle class, and that was a big slogan. And we here at the council, we're looking at it in terms of U.S. global engagement. This is really great, tying global issues to the doorstep, right? That's why we called this podcast The Doorstep. And yet that seems to have blown up because tying domestic issues to foreign policy issues has kind of gone out of whack. Instead of being a positive, it seems to become this, powder keg.
It's a very dangerous move in a lot of ways. I mean, look, when the administration took office, a lot of this kind of was the brainchild of Jake Sullivan, right? He's the national security advisor, and he used to be one of Hillary Clinton's top advisors, and he watched her lose. And, he kept asking himself, why? And this is a guy who like very rarely fails at anything in his entire life. So this was not normal for him. And so he went about and he researched it and he realized, okay, there's this huge number of people in America who really feel like globalization has undercut them. They've lost their jobs. Factories are closing. Their downtowns are being hollowed out. And so this idea of bringing back kind of industry and types of economic policy that will help the U.S. middle class and working class and lower class, so that there's protectionist measures that don't hurt these people and, in the long run, don't hurt democratic electoral prospects. This was part of it. And along the way, they realized this is all tied together. I mean, the coronavirus was an example of how domestic and international policy just can't necessarily be disaggregated when you think about things like supply chains and how one country can really screw over another country if they're too dependent on each other. So this was kind of about restoring not only America's economic might and ability, but also its self-reliance as opposed to being too reliant on other countries that are not necessarily always reliable, such as China, right? So this was all part of it. And this idea that like foreign and domestic policy were very separate spheres, the administration kind of said, this isn't real. We have to just accept that the silos are crumbling, that everything is coming together, and these things affect each other. And so that's kind of how they went about it. Now, it kind of bothered a lot of people in Europe. They were pretty upset about some of the laws that were passed here, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave a lot of incentives to companies to come to the United States, undercutting European efforts to keep companies there. It's become a thorn, but it's also kind of injected some competition. So a lot of this, is happening. But yes, that also leads to this increasing tension. And it also means that if you're someone, who has the point of view of a lot of people on the far right and maybe some on the far left, that, government is the problem and government is the issue and we need to just stop the government and stop it from doing anything, then you have a lot of incentive to throw sand into these gears and stop it and try to connect things in a way that makes everything stop, such as border security and Ukraine aid. So this is the question of how, are people going to increasingly try to maneuver around this system so that they can link things in a way that undermines the very functioning of government if they just don't think government is a good thing, as many folks do. And it's combining that with the way that US politics is going, with people increasingly in their own kind of media bubbles, not listening to one another, just having completely different views of what is going on in reality. It is really, really weird. I mean, I got to tell you, there's so many strange things happening out there. You have lawmakers going out there, they voted against bills, infrastructure bills, right? But that funneled projects to their communities. They voted against these bills, and now they're touting all these new projects in their communities that they voted against. And it's just wild. So it's pretty crazy. So I don't know where omnipolicy is going to go. It could become like omnivorous and eat us all alive.
Well, that takes us to what policy is going to emerge. And I want to kind of, because you were in Davos, talking about, democratic models, and, your column Compass is just so good. I really want to tell people, again, to go find you and find that column, because some of the quotes you've gotten, and especially the piece about democracy, a quote that you had, I don't know if in the coming years people will be looking at the United States as a model for democracy. I'm laughing because this is a good one. The U.S. is a fat buffalo trying to take a nap as hungry wolves approach, the envoy mused. I can hear those champagne bottle corks popping in Moscow like it's Christmas every bleep day.
Yeah.
These are strong sentiments about the prospects for, the U.S. as a democratic model, never mind omnipolicy, and this is our standing and what we have promoted around the world, and people taking these cracks at it. Is there someone else then taking the lead or standing up as a democratic or other leader, another option? Is there another option?
I mean, nothing immediately comes to mind. Like if you like look there was this, remember under Trump, like people referred to Angela Merkel of Germany as the leader of the free world, right? It was just this kind of joke. Is there another functioning, decently functioning democracy out there that people can look at as a role model? I don't know. Maybe the Australians. I don't know. Everything's a bit of a mess, right? No one is perfect. No country has a perfect track record by any means. I think that's one reason, to be honest, that so many foreign diplomats, and were former and current, were willing to talk to me for that column. It was my second column. And because honest to God, like a few months ago or a couple of years ago, none of these people would have talked to me about this, because there is a rule. There's rules, there's traditions, there's pragmatic reasons that foreign diplomats do not talk about the internal politics of the countries where they're serving. All they ever say is, we will work with whoever's elected, we will deal with it. They don't like to talk about that because they don't want to take sides, and they don't want to anger whoever might win in the future and come into power. So they just avoid internal politics, and I cannot tell you how many times over the years I've tried to get people to talk about this issue, and they've just totally blown me off. So this time when I went into it, I honestly walked into that embassy to talk to that ambassador thinking I was going to get kicked out. Like I was like, I should go ahead and schedule my Uber, like this is not gonna. And instead, this ambassador, to my utter shock, just went on and on and on. And I was like, wow, but it shows you how much has changed in the last few months as they've seen Trump possibly become the nominee again for the Republican Party, as they've watched the Ukraine aid get tied to border issues, as they've just seen this the far right rise in the House of Representatives and just basically bring it to a stop. When you have a House of Representatives that has such a hard time choosing a speaker, like people overseas are watching this and they're like, this is not good. And one of the reasons, to be really frank, is that this is not like altruistic. It's not like they're like, oh, we just love America. No, it's because America is a role model, and it's such an important pillar on so many levels when it comes to things like NATO, when it comes to things like the regional architecture of security in Asia. This affects all the other countries around the world, and they want stability, and they want a partner in America that they can count on. One of the deep frustrations that I heard was, look, we don't know if we can enter an agreement with the United States anymore, because we don't know if the next guy who takes in charge, or next woman, whatever, who takes power, is going to just walk away from that agreement. they just don't feel like we're reliable anymore. And when it comes to these types of long-term decisions, whether it's an agreement on trade or a treaty related to security, they want to know that Washington is going to be reliable and consistent in its foreign policy, and they just are not getting that right now. So there's a lot of there's a lot of people holding their breath, and so this is what the column was trying to convey: is the deep frustration. Some of these people do love America. Some of them studied here. They are deeply concerned about the health of the American political system, and so they felt like they had to speak out.
Speaking of the health of the American political system, we have Defense Secretary Austin just coming out of the hospital. We have questions about Biden's age and cognitive abilities, right? Let's think about, what this American foreign policy might look like if we have a Biden second term. Are you getting the sense that there's going to be some upheaval? Are you seeing Kamala step up in any way? In one of our previous discussions, you had mentioned that she was really focused on border and the global South, but that I haven't heard anything. Like, has she stepped up in foreign policy? Do you see should there be a Biden, 2.0? Do you see changes? Have you heard anything?
So look, I think just naturally you're going to see some turnover. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a new Secretary of State, a new National Security Advisor, possibly a new Defense Secretary. Some of this is just because these jobs are absolutely exhausting. I mean, if you look at Tony Blinken these days, he looks very, very tired. These things are difficult, and there is kind of a sense that maybe it's time to have some new blood, some new thinking. But look, some of these people, like, they also may want to have kids. They want. I mean, there's just life things that will lead, I think, to some changes. Who will replace them? That I really don't know. I mean, some of it might be a bit of musical chairs. I think there's some belief that either, Jake Sullivan might become Secretary of State. If not him, actually, I think the preferred theory is Bill Burns, who's the director of the CIA, and he used to be the former Deputy Secretary of State. So there are people gaming these things out. I have learned that it's kind of pointless to try to make solid predictions. That doesn't stop my editors from making me do it. Um, but there's always a surprise or two. But I just think one thing that I am pretty confident in is that there will be changes. And they might bring in new people from the outside. It's very it's tricky. One thing I will say though that they have to think about is, given the kind of I think I can objectively say, like, insanity in the house. Like, I think I can use that term. Um, you know, you just don't know what's gonna happen, legislatively to try to affect the whole setup of the system. And what happens in the House affects the Senate too. Senate Republicans are not immune from the pressures that the House brings. So when it comes to things like confirmations, that's another important factor. So if there isn't a second Biden term, I wouldn't be surprised if this time they really have a lot of problems getting top level people confirmed. Even if they're highly qualified, like, people in the Senate just might decide to just put a halt on things. I mean, remember what Tommy Tuberville did with the promotions of the military. So they also have to factor that in. Like, is this person going to survive confirmation? Are they even going to get a hearing? And that is something that's really, like, that really bothers, by the way, a lot of foreign leaders. They look at that and they just think that that's just dysfunctional. And it's unacceptable. And it's something that's gotten much, much worse in the last 15 to 20 years. It did not used to be this way. But now you can barely get your people through. And I should be clear that that happens on both sides. It's not just Republicans, it's also Democrats.
Mm-hmm. And Kamala, have you heard any more about her in the foreign policy realm?
Not a lot. I mean, she occasionally does, like, step in and go overseas on various trips, whether I believe she went to the Pacific Islands. It's been a while. Um, you know, She has her moments. There's been nothing where she has really stood out as like, this is her issue. Um, eh, Look, on the border stuff, like, she has had extremely limited impact there, but to be frank, everyone has limited impact there. I mean, it's one of those things that is solvable. The people know what the answers are, the solutions are. It's not that it's a policy issue, it's a political issue. And so if you have people who just don't want to solve it because they want to use it to campaign, then you're gonna have a problem. It's a lot of this, yeah. No, I mean, so Kamala, no, I can't really say that like she looms large. But that said, I have, talked to people who work with her and for her. They really like her. They really do. They say they speak very highly of her. They say she's really on top, like, she really gets the issues. She's learned a great deal. Like, people warn not to underestimate her, and sometimes, as you know, it's kind of people it's about being given, like, the opportunity or the moment, and I'm not sure she's necessarily had that because there's always the president to think about. So it's tricky. I think she's much stronger in domestic issues than foreign policy, but, people, like I said, have told me not to underestimate her.
Mhm. Speaking of strength in foreign policy, your latest piece talks about Blinken and how he, not only is tired, but may not be as strong as we need him to be on the international stage, especially with this latest crisis. And I'm wondering if that's also affecting kind of our standing in the world. Here's our major, representative going around, and if he doesn't have the authority with world leaders, with Netanyahu, who is one of your examples in your piece, where does that leave the U.S. In this last year before a major election? And also, I might add, when all countries in the world, or many, not all, but many countries in the world are dealing with their own elections and changeover.
Yeah, that's right. This is definitely a record year for elections. We're like more than half the world's population is voting in some sort of election or has the opportunity to. So it is pretty extraordinary what all is happening. Look, with Blinken, it's really a Middle East issue for him. Like, he keeps going back to the Middle East, and actually, it's really an Israel issue. Keeps going back there, keeps asking them to do certain things, like let in flour, so the Gazans can be able to have bread. And he's running into defiance, essentially, from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has his own political issues that he's trying to work out. And over again, Blinken goes. At most, he gets incremental response. Often, he gets nothing. And yeah, I mean, he looks weak on the global stage right now. Now, his people are like, look, this is one of those very, very difficult issues. I don't know that another Secretary of State would necessarily get a better result from Benjamin Netanyahu. Um, but their response is simply like, had we not kept going back over and over again, things would be way, way, way worse for the Palestinians in Gaza right now. And we have to keep trying, and we have to keep going until there's breakthrough. And when you look at dealing with the Middle East, with people like Jim Baker and Henry Kissinger, I mean, you know, Jim Baker back in like the early 90s, in I think it was 1991, he took at least like 9 trips to the region to try to organize a peace conference. And there wasn't even like a massive war like there is right now. You know what I mean? There's always a conflict, but there wasn't like what's going on right now. So this is infinitely more complex. I mean, but the thing about Blinken is that he's so diplomatic, especially in public, that you kind of you kind of wonder if people just aren't taking him seriously as they could. Look, if he yells at you in private, but you defy him, and then he goes out in public and says he totally supports you and everything's great and we're working on it, that doesn't really have a lot of impact. So my argument was maybe he should like say something in public, flash his temper in public against the Israelis, because this really is again like an Israeli issue. Um, and that might maybe cause some movement on certain fronts with Israel. And it might actually lead some Arab leaders to make some different calculations as well if they realize, wow, Tony Blinken is mad. and he's mad in public. And whoa, maybe there's a real problem here. Maybe we can't just screw around with this administration anymore. So I don't know. I don't know that he's going to take my advice. But if he does, I'm certainly going to take credit for it. But I'm kidding. But I mean, we will see. We will see how that goes. This is a tough group of countries to deal with. It's not easy for anyone.
So speaking of, all that, the Biden administration has had to deal with on the foreign policy front, we have a huge focus on domestic elections, kind of really ramping up now. How much is foreign policy going to take a backseat, do you think? First question. And then second, we talked in most of our conversations, until the Ukraine war, like it's all about China, 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 China. And like now, like nobody's talking about China.
Yeah.
So, what happened to China, and who's the boogeyman now? Is it Putin? Isn't that like who are we going to be, what should the US public be looking for? And I'm actually going to throw in okay, answer those two. And I have one last one before we go.
Yeah. So look, I actually think foreign policy might play a bigger role than usual. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to play a defining role. But if you look at some of the things that have been happening, first of all, this whole issue over Ukraine aid, with Trump coming out and saying things like, NATO didn't pay, and so I would encourage them, as in the Russians, to attack a NATO country that isn't spending enough on defense. I mean, when Trump says stuff like this, it gives an opportunity for Biden and his team to exploit. And I think if that continues, that means it's going to be a bigger deal. Than I think most people expected. I think the Republicans' intransigence on the border aid and connecting to the Ukraine aid and connecting it to Israel aid, by the way, and Taiwan aid, those things are also in there. That could come back to haunt them if a lot of people look at the situation and they're like, guys, like, you got to get your act together. Like, this is just, obstructionism. Nothing else is happening. So in that sense, it might play a role. Another way in which it could play a role is there's so much anger in the Democratic base, and especially among Arab Americans, against Biden over his handling of the Middle East crisis. There's this belief that he is just not valuing Palestinian lives the way he should, and he should be telling Israel to pursue a ceasefire. He has his reasons for not doing that, but the reason that is important is that in the state of Michigan, you have a huge number of Arab American voters, and that's a battleground state. And that is, so it just means that like a few votes could make a difference in terms of the electoral college and in terms of the whole US election. And the Biden team is finally getting that. They've been sending people to talk to Arab American activists and others to try to explain their reasoning, to everything but apologize for some of their messaging, things like that. But I have to tell you, this is, I think, a really big deal. And while Arab Americans are not monolithic and they don't all vote the same way, and it's not like Trump is going to be better for their cause, this is a real problem. So in those ways, I think foreign policy could play a big role. And like I said, I still expect some major foreign policy crisis to happen this year, just as it has in the past 3 years. And for all I know, it could be involving Taiwan and China. So maybe China, which has really kind of fallen off the fallen off the radar a bit, as both sides try to stabilize the relationship. Like, if that happens, I mean, wow, talk about a potential October surprise, right? I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I think, if anything, the Chinese really want to avoid something like that. Right now, they have their own economic issues. But again, I just think given the pattern, there's going to be some sort of a crisis. As a certain senior diplomat mentioned to me, what about North Korea? Did you forget about North Korea? And we can't ever forget about North Korea. So.
Oh, we will not forget about North Korea. Thank you so much for joining us, Nahal. I do want to have one last question. Still on Threads? Should we go back to Twitter? All my students are telling me to get back on Twitter. They love Twitter. Have we just it's this cancel culture is now canceled because we've forgotten why we didn't like Twitter. What
I
are you
mean,
doing? Tell me, I need guidance.
I'm using all of them. I'm using Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, and Twitter. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Twitter still has the most impact. But because I lost my blue check mark and they changed the algorithm or whatever, I don't get nearly as much engagement as I used to. But I really I feel like Threads has made a huge mistake by downplaying news. And that's just a huge error on their part. And so when there is a big news event breaking, it's useless to go to Threads or the others. I mean, you still have to go to Twitter, and it's not what it used to be. But it's still better than the others, unfortunately. I mean, maybe I do think it is fixable. Maybe in the next few years or whatever, there will be a change at Twitter and they can bring back what it was. Because honestly, as a news gathering tool, as an information tool, as a distribution channel, it was really, really crucial for me, and I really do miss it. And it was kind of sad how much a big part of my social life it was too. That was kind of sad. I mean, I feel like that's changed a bit. I've become more social in real life, but but yeah, I miss the old Twitter, but I'm making do with the current Twitter.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that advice and for all of your insights. We look forward to your next column and talking to you soon.
Thanks for having me.